it makes sense at this point, I think, to turn to a really important article in the context of philosophical naturalism. That's Willard Van Orman Quine's excellent article, Epistemology Naturalized. This is where the second objection I was referring to a short while ago sort of traces back to. Quine argued quite compellingly, I think, in Epistemology Naturalized, that the best way to solve the deep problems of epistemology, about how it's possible to know things, about what it means to know things, what's the relationship between belief and knowledge, and so forth, these kinds of deep epistemological questions are better addressed by science. Maybe not necessarily today, but the goal of epistemology as a philosophical discipline should be to help science pave a way to the point where it can address these questions and possibly even answer them. Now, in a previous lecture, I talked about Quine's notion of the web of belief, and you can, if you recall what that's like, hopefully you can sort of come to the conclusion that he's not going to be very big on the idea of foundationalism. Quine is very much an anti-foundationalist thinker. He's, the notion, the visual of a web is very, very appropriate for how epistemology works in Quine's mind, and he thinks it's actually going to work the same way for basically any kind of sets of beliefs that you're talking about, whether they be scientific, philosophical, political, religious, whatever. So if we're going to give up on the idea of providing foundations for epistemology in the way people like René Descartes wanted to do, Quine wants to take us one step further and say ultimately that epistemological questions can be answered empirically. You want to know what the nature of belief is. You want to know what it means to know things and so forth. We should not think of these as conceptual questions. These are not armchair questions. These are questions that have to be answered with properly structured experiments. In the long run, what Quine forecasted was that epistemology should be reduced to cognitive science. The job of cognitive science fundamentally is to tell us how beliefs form and how they change over time and so forth, and what the rules that govern belief are. Now, cognitive science as it exists today isn't quite capable of doing that, at least not in a sort of an exhaustive fashion. So for the time being, at least, there is still room for sort of more philosophically oriented epistemology. But that is something that is presumably only a temporary standard. And in the same way that there was a time in which questions about the nature of matter were viewed fundamentally as philosophical questions, now those questions have shifted pretty clearly into the realm of physics in a lot of ways. We should expect the exact same kinds of migration to happen over time as cognitive science expands and matures. And philosophers, Quine thinks, shouldn't be afraid of this. What we really want to be concerned about ultimately is understanding reality, not with sort of preserving our territorial turf, as it were. If cognitive science can do a better job of answering epistemological questions than philosophers, then philosophers should happily concede this to them. Now, it's worth noting here that Peter Godfrey Smith actually rejects Quine's vision here. He rejects it because he simply thinks that it really there are some questions which are better addressed from a philosophical point of view. Again, that's not to say, obviously, that cognitive science doesn't have a lot to say about epistemology. Peter Godfrey Smith is very much in favor of cognitive science. He thinks it's a worthwhile discipline. And this isn't just some sort of territorial dispute. He isn't trying to stand up for philosophy just because he's afraid of being put out of a job. Rather, when he simply assesses the kinds of questions that epistemology is ultimately interested in, some of them might be reducible to cognitive science. And cognitive science definitely can shed light in this area. But ultimately, the job of philosophy should be to help and facilitate and understand the broad array of questions, not all of which appear to be amenable to straightforward empirical reduction. So science and philosophy should sort of work together, hand in hand, to understand knowledge. It shouldn't be a matter of science simply paving the way, philosophy simply paving the way for cognitive science to eventually take over. So we can probably make room within naturalism for philosophy as a sort of a distinctive area, even if it's not sort of clearly defined, even if it is sort of vague, even if the scientific questions and the philosophical questions sort of bleed over in a lot of ways. There will be some areas and some questions that we can sort of see as broadly philosophical or more philosophical and less scientific, and vice versa. And this is sort of more or less the picture that Peter Godfrey Smith proposes. He outlines three sort of questions that he thinks are sort of distinctively philosophical that can sort of still hold in the philosophy of science. So the first question is, how do we make sense of the role of values in science? The second is, how do we reconcile science with common sense? And the third is, how do we integrate the various different sciences? Now, I want to talk about each of these three questions in turn, but it's important to note these are not sort of distinctively philosophical questions. That isn't to say that that you can't sort of answer these questions purely from the armchair or purely through philosophical reflection. Obviously, there needs to be a large dose of scientific literacy that philosophers draw on if they want to answer these questions. Philosophy and science do have to sort of work hand in glove, as it were. So science, again, from Peter Godfrey Smith's point of view, can speak to these questions. It can inform these questions, but they don't really address them directly. It's not the job of the physicist working in the lab to sit around and explain the role of values in science. They may have some ideas about that, and of course they're welcome to partake in conversation about these ideas. But the kinds of stuff that physicists or biologists are publishing, the kinds of things they're experimenting on, are probably going to be focused less on the question about exactly what the role of values are, or how exactly to reconcile science with common sense, or how to integrate the various sciences. They're going to be a part of that conversation, but that's not going to be their day job. That's not going to be what they're spending most of their time on. That's the job for philosophers of science, to focus on those questions most directly. Now, this first question about how to sort of understand the role of values is addressed directly by a school of thought known as normative naturalism. This is an attempt to understand how it is, again, under the assumption that there is sort of only one sphere of inquiry, and that is the natural world. How do we find a place for values in the natural world? And if the job of science is to explain the natural world, then how can it explain where values come from? Now, I've addressed several times in the past the so-called is-ought distinction, and how a sort of a close study of the history of 20th century philosophy of science really sort of muddies this is-ought distinction. Now, the is-ought distinction was very big for David Hume. He sort of thought there was a fundamental divide between is questions and ought questions. And then I've said in particular when talking about Thomas Kuhn that Thomas Kuhn basically sort of rejects this distinction outright. He says, at least when it comes to scientific practice, there really is no way of parsing these two. Science is what science does. Scientists ought to do what the best scientific practices are. And so it doesn't really make sense from Kuhn's point of view to draw a hard and fast distinction between is and ought. And I can sort of take this sort of one step further by going again back to cognitive science. In a field like cognitive science, facts and values bleed together in a very, very muddy paste kind of way. The job of the cognitive scientist isn't simply to come in and describe how beliefs are formed. That's part of what we want them to do. But we also want the cognitive science to help us understand what is a good belief and what is a bad one. How do we distinguish when and what sort of cognitive practices are the most reliable ones, are the most useful ones, are the most trustworthy ones? If cognitive science can't address these questions, then it's going to be a pretty limited field. So that is to say that science can inform different approaches to the questions about values, but ultimately it's the job of philosophy to try to solve how we should understand the relationship between science and values. To the second question about reconciling science to common sense. If you recall the very first lecture in this series, I showed a picture of my bust of Albert Einstein. Now, I did this to try to contrast the apparent sort of continuous nature that we have of the object that we experience in the common sense world versus what you might sort of call the Swiss cheese model of quantum mechanics, whereby which all solid objects are basically 98% empty space. This is a conflict between the scientific picture of reality and the common sense picture of reality. Now, maybe we can try to appeal to science to try to make sense of this conflict. Now, again, we could just sort of take a shut up and trust science point of view. We could just say that, yes, that the idea that matter is sort of continuous and solid is just an illusion, and we should just ignore it. We should ignore this common sense picture and trust the scientific picture. But, well, that is really an incredibly difficult position to take. Even people who are well educated in quantum physics have a hard time looking at material matter and thinking constantly all the time that really it's just empty space, because this problem just keeps staring us in the face. Again, I like to open with that problem with a picture of the bust of Einstein, because it really does, I think, drive home how weird quantum physics is, and how weird in many ways the scientific picture of reality that we get from 20th and 21st century science conflicts with the way that we naturally, automatically see the world. Again, the whole idea behind science is it's supposed to be sort of a formalized way of looking at the world. It's supposed to be based on experience and observation. But in this instance, experience and observation deeply conflict with what what quantum theory tells us. This is exactly where philosophy can come in and shine and help try to sort of reconcile these two very different pictures of the world to one another in a way that reduces the conflict and makes it and sort of takes off our cognitive disease that we have with trying to integrate these two pictures. Here's a quick sketch of a couple of other philosophical topics that science can possibly help solve. There's the age-old free will and determinism debate. There is the old dualism and monism debate in the philosophy of mind. There is the reason and emotion debate in the philosophy of emotion. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of debates in moral theory. In particular, I think there's been recently a lot of work done in cognitive science that has claimed to actually sort of disprove Kantian moral psychology. So I'm not going to go into any of these debates here, but suffice to say, anyone that's working in any of these arguments today in philosophy has got to be well informed of the scientific research that bears on these fields. You can't really talk about dualism and monism in the philosophy of mind without understanding neuroscience. You can't have debates about sort of the fundamental nature of moral psychology without looking at empirical moral psychology, about looking at the work that's done using things like fMRIs and studies on psychopaths and sociopaths and so forth. These questions at one point in history were sort of armchair debates. They were debates that philosophers could engage in simply by sitting back and reflecting on these things. But that's no longer the case. If you're working as a professional philosopher on any of these questions today, you have got to know what empirical science is saying about these things. Now again, that's not to say that science is going to be able to solve these questions once and for all, but it's simply to say that you cannot have an informed debate about these questions these days without understanding what it is that science has to say about these. And so, again, the naturalistic picture gives an excellent explanation of why this is the case, of why it is that these debates have migrated from sort of a purely conceptual realm into something of a mixed conceptual and empirical realm. Okay, to the third point about integrating the sciences. As I said a short while ago, the distinctions between the academic sciences don't necessarily track real differences in nature. It's not like nature comes with a sort of a clear delineating point of where physics ends and chemistry begins, or where chemistry ends and biology begins. The sort of spectrum of nature, the kind of, so to speak, levels of nature are really sort of not integrated in some sort of clear delineated way. Departments, academic departments, are set up on the basis not so much of this is where it makes sense to draw the line based on the evidence, but rather because of various sort of political, economic, historical, and personal influences. And of course, again, science and data matters too. I'm not suggesting that these are purely political distinctions, but they're far less from sort of a pure evidence-driven distinction than you might sort of naively think going into it. And so this can result in a whole host of interdisciplinary problems. Like Thomas Kuhn pointed out, one way to solve or one way to deal with an anomaly in your field is to simply try to relegate that anomaly to another field. This isn't a problem for me. This is a problem for a physical chemist. This is a problem for a biochemist, not a problem for my field. And that there's a certain kind of intellectual dishonesty about that, about sort of just shuffling problems around that are uncomfortable so you don't have to deal with them. Different fields will formulate questions in different ways. They will come up with contradictory answers. They will develop incompatible models. Now, one benefit that philosophers can play when it comes to scientists is to sort of act as sort of independent arbiters with regard to these kinds of entrenched disciplines. So think, for example, about human behavior. What field is the proper study of human behavior? Well, cognitive science studies human behavior, but so does behavioral psychology, so does sociobiology, so does sociology, so does behavioral economics. All of these fields are attempting to shed light on human behavior. Now, if you are entrenched in one of these fields, naturally you're going to give priority to the point of view from your particular field. And sometimes academic disputes across fields can get kind of petty, and they can get kind of confusing because people are so entrenched in their own perspectives that they can't really step outside to sort of look at the sort of collective field overall. this is something that philosophy can do in a lot of ways. And philosophers who are interested in human behavior are going to at least have a working understanding of probably all of these fields and be able to work at ways that help these people in these different disciplines communicate constructively with one another rather than talking across purposes. Another good example of this kind of phenomena, it happens in the philosophy of physics. Now, I've mentioned several times that quantum mechanics and general relativity appear on their face to be incompatible with one another. Now, this is the kind of thing where, again, a philosopher of physics, philosophers of physics are very, very well versed in high-end theory, high-end physical theory, but they come at it less so from a purely experimental fashion and more from a sort of theoretical fashion. And actually, when you read a lot of work in theoretical physics, it's damn hard to distinguish from philosophy. I mean, probably no better example of this comes from the work of Albert Einstein himself. The vast majority of Einstein's work is deeply laden with references to people like Immanuel Kant, for example. You really want to understand sort of the intellectual world of Albert Einstein. You have to have an understanding of a whole host of philosophers. Schopenhauer was another big influence on Einstein. So when you read theoretical physics, it's kind of hard in a lot of ways to distinguish it from philosophy. It's very, very technical philosophy, very, very high-end philosophy, as it were, but it, like a lot of philosophy, is often detached from straightforward practical application. Okay, all right, so that covers sort of the three questions that Peter Godfrey Smith was looking at. Let's try to sort of take this framework now and go back and take a look at a variety of different things that we've looked at, different perspectives we've looked at, and see what we can borrow from a naturalistic perspective to try to sort of address some of the problems that we've encountered before. So the work of Emir Lakatos, for example, can help naturalism address the new riddle of induction. Remember how the new riddle of induction worked? You know, we could make the generalization all emeralds are green, and that seems supported by the evidence, but we can also make the generalization all emeralds are grue, and that's also supported by all the evidence. So if the evidence is neutral between these two different theories, but the two different theories give completely opposite predictions about what the next color emerald is going to be, Goodman says we're at an impasse. Well, Lakatos had a nice little idea about the idea of a progressive versus a degenerating research program. Now, it might be the case that if you look at this problem from a Lakatosian lens, what you can come to the conclusion is that the hypothesis that all emeralds are green, it's not superior because it's more supported by the evidence. Goodman was right about that. The evidence is neutral between all emeralds are green and all emeralds are grue. But the research program that says all emeralds are green is going to be a more progressive research program. It's going to be more useful. We're going to be able to do more with it. We're going to be able to set up more constructive, more productive kinds of scientific disciplines for that hypothesis as opposed to the alternative. Back to logical positivism or logical empiricism. Naturalists are going to agree with the logical positivists that fundamentally science has to be grounded in experience. That is to say that scientific problems can't be solved in some sort of a priori fashion. Indeed, naturalists tend to reject the idea that there's some sort of special philosophical a priori knowledge in the way people like Immanuel Kant, people like René Descartes or Plato wanted to argue for. So yes, fundamentally knowledge, in particular science, is grounded in experience. But science is not merely limited to experience, according to the naturalists. There has to be room for theory that exists in a way that is informed by but fundamentally distinct from experience. Karl Popper can get in on the action here too. The naturalists are going to agree with Popper that science has to expose their theories to the world through testing. You can't construct your theories in a way that immunizes them from falsification in the way that people like Karl Marx or Sigmund Freud seem to do. At the same time, though, the naturalists are probably going to reject the idea that falsification is the core defining trait of science. It's going to be part of science. Falsification is going to be important, something to keep in mind, but you're not going to get some sort of hard, rigid, deductive form of falsification that's going to be able to clearly and definitively distinguish science from pseudoscience. Further debts and differences. Again, back to Quine. Now, again, Quine himself is a naturalist, so it's not going to be too hard to sort of see how naturalists are going to be able to draw on his thinking. This whole idea about holism about testing, that whenever you perform a test, you're not simply testing one isolated idea, you're testing a whole cluster, a whole part of the web of belief. That's going to be something which is going to be a very, very common theme in naturalism. Fundamentally, all beliefs, according to Quine, even beliefs about the nature of logic, are going to be revisable if enough ideas, enough evidence, enough argument sort of aligns against them. At the same time, though, unless you do want to go sort of wholesale Quinean reductionist, you're probably going to want to throw out the idea that, like Peter Godfrey Smith says, that all philosophy can sort of be reduced to scientific questions. That it's a radical position, and some naturalists do follow Quine that far, but a more common position, in my experience, is the position of Peter Godfrey Smith, that there are, at least while the two things do work together, there are some distinctively philosophical questions, not necessarily in a hard and fast way, but at least in a general way. Okay, Thomas Kuhn. Again, I think naturalists tend to sort of side with Kuhn in the idea that you can't fundamentally separate is from ought in science. These two things do kind of bleed together. Again, if there is only sort of one sphere of inquiry that is the natural world, then that means that values are things that happen in the natural world. They're not supernatural. They don't exist in some other plane, and that means that the way to understand how values relate to facts is by understanding that values and facts are sort of part and parcel of the same scientific discipline. Good science is what good science does, if I can sort of Forrest Gump-eyes Thomas Kuhn there. At the ultimate end of the day, one of the big takeaways that we get from Kuhn is that philosophy isn't about providing foundations for science in the way the logical positivists want. But at the same time, I think that naturalists are probably going to want to disagree with Kuhn that the fundamental questions about science are ultimately just sort of to be trusted up to the scientific community, that we should sort of just say that the most rational thing to do in any situation is simply defer to what the scientific community thinks. The scientific community obviously is going to play a big role in the conversation, but there's been a long list of people in working in science recently who have been very, very dismissive towards philosophy, and oftentimes that attitude leads not just to sort of to people looking down their noses at philosophy, but actually to people doing really bad philosophy and really bad science. The philosopher Daniel Dennett once said, I'm paraphrasing here, that there's no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science that is done without examining its philosophical baggage. Now to the sociology of science. Obviously, one of the core themes of this class that I've come back to again and again is the social structure of science is a key and indispensable part of the success of science. We need sort of social structures to distribute epistemic labor in the right way, to say, you people focus on these problems, you people focus on these problems. The social structure of science sets up things like scientific journals and peer review and so forth. It allows for the funding of otherwise unaffordable scientific experiments, and it allows for sort of collective oversight of theories and testing and retesting and duplicating of experiments. All that stuff is impossible without a properly organized social structure. At the same time, though, they're going to reject the sort of sociology of science's idea that fundamentally science doesn't respond to data, that's just driven by social interests, just driven by politics. That kind of radicalism is going to be rejected by most naturalists.